Hello. So, hello everyone, and thank you very much for being here for the launch of the CBD book, also at Swansea University. This particular launch, as it was announced, will be, in a way, specially tailored for students, but it does cover the content of the book. So also for the colleagues who are here, thank you very much for it. I am sure that you will make sense of what is being said, although it doesn't go in all the detail that it would have been if it was only for you. So with this said, let me share the slides and we start our dive in the couch-based development. Okay. So the agenda for today is meant to be like this. I will give you about 30 minutes presentation. Ignore the timing because we start a little bit later. But this presentation will give you an idea what is the main message of the book, what is the methodology of the book, and what is the value add that it holds. No. And then there will be an intervention from two colleagues. Both of them are very well known to you. The one is the one and only Daniel Nehring, who is a sociologist, who is from a different department, but this is one of the departments which is closest to the culture-based development for heart, because sociology is all about culture. Okay? So he will give us the sociological nexus of how a sociologist reads this book. And then there will be Nigel O'Leary, who is the department, and who has already spoken about this at the first launch, which was in, I believe, February in Albania. And he's an economist who also has a super gift for teaching. So one of the things that I wanted him to explain is to students how what they learn is just tools that then they can use creatively for thinking. And this book is doing exactly this. It is using the basic economic tools and it's venturing them in a field where they have not been used in this way before. So in a way, if you wish, it is a use of economic methods the way that at some point the public choice people did. They took the basic economic mechanisms and they brought them to political questions, policy involved. So this culture-based development paradigm that I'm working on for Sponsor One is doing the same thing. It is taking the tools of economics and is bringing them, but this time in the field of culture. And it's saying, well, many people are interested in culture ever since economics existed, right? The moral philosophers were thinking about it. But while there are many interesting things written and within economics and outside of economics about culture, none of them has really tried to be both comprehensive about culture and using the economic basics the way that we use them today as modern economists, right? So there are many interesting stories. They have certain interpretations. Some people are more interested into how they name culture. Is it a public good? Is it a mixed good? And then they make their career on that side of the story. Others contribute by saying, okay, there is cultural value, economic value, and they distinguish this, they make their career on that. Others who take one aspect of it, such as certain trait of culture, be trust and any other kind of family relationship. And then they do valuable stuff. Some of them are actually very dear to me, but those who have managed to make a little bit more comprehensive understanding of culture. And when they talk about more comprehensive aggregate level of it, like taste for discrimination, because this is not just one trait, right? You can have taste for discrimination based on many culture. And then it makes sense. And then they do use wonderful models. But what has happened to economics is because of many inherited problems and ongoing problems. Like they didn't have enough maths and stuff back then to disentangle all the problems between carbon and carbon. Nowadays we can do. And that's what culture-based development do. But then people got used to that. And then they decided to use only preferences, right? And the big question remains how these preferences on which all other modeling and all the sophistication developments that we have done, which are worthwhile, right? How the first thing that drives them all emerges. Okay? And this first thing is culture. So that's why it is called culture-based development, because culture is what gives us meaning to the things, value of it. We don't know what to think of the world. We start thinking of the world after we are taught what is good and what is bad as toddlers. There are two ways to learn about the world. Either you poke something and you see whether it bites you or not, or your mommy or whoever is raising you there is telling you, no, this is good, this is bad for you. And this goes on forever. And you end up one day not doing certain things just because you're taught and trained to do that, not because you really reflect. And then you carry it in all your existence. And of course, once you're programmed in this way, if we know your program, how you're programmed, we will know what to choose, what to do, and how you act. But why you're programmed, if you'll be programmed like this hasn't been tackled with economics principles so far. So that's what this book is trying to do. So I can speak about this a lot and I don't get tired about it because I love it. This is the 10th time that I'm making a talk about the book, the 10th event of what I call the CBD Caravan of Knowledge, which started in Albania, then went to British Columbia, then went to Brussels and Luxembourg, then went to Aberystwyth, then went to Manchester, then went to Athens for 2 events and so on and so forth, and it rolls now. It's caravan here. But then, meanwhile, while I was in Greece, and by the way, in Rhodes, I found this, which made my day. Essentially, the Knights of St. John were one of the most important knights that we have, because they defended historically the whole of Europe and so on. Had a rule. You become a knight if you make 3 caravans. So now I call all the stops of my caravan the first caravan. I have 2 more, then become knight. There is hope in this as well, because Joshua Bell was recently knighted. Right? This is still ongoing for the, his work there with St. Martin's. So that much for the fun. What I will do is tell you what is the core of the topic of culture-based development, the main idea. Because culture is very broad. How exactly culture is handled? What is the culture-based development? What is its worldview? And then I'll talk about the methods behind which this worldview and how it is approached in the research, because the book actually is a sum up of all my endeavor since my PhD and before. I am working on culture-based development ever since. There was even a book which was planned to be published when I finished my master's, based on my master's. Well, long story short, didn't get published, but this is the first book of CBD, and I'm very happy about that. Because now there is some degree of confidence that what I say in the book is something I have checked, it's right. Okay, there are many things which remain to be done, so I don't think it's a story done. That's why the initial title of the book was meant to be Founding Principles of Culture-Based Development. In other words, this is the foundation, this is the basic things that I figured out, right? And they're really how you define and how you measure culture and how you know it emerges to identify it in the model. And then how to augment the model with it. But then all the augmentations that can be done are job undone yet. So this is the whole story. And then I'll try to synthesize, given this topic, given this approach and these methods, what is the value coming, the value added coming from it. So one day I was sitting there having a cup of tea, and I was admiring my cup, and I realized, well, that's actually really my cup of tea. This is the tulips, and this is the classical way that this was meant for students. Okay? So the tulip mania is one of the first things that started to rethink the dynamics how culture makes behavior non-rational. And then there are books about the event from a historic point of view. Some economists also work But then I was even more amazed by this little cup of tea that randomly ended up being in front of me, because I noticed my little tea bag message, which was saying, give us tranquility and tolerance so we can live in compassion. And this is the main mechanism that culture-based development suggests as existing behind the reason why culture emerges. Okay? People are born and exist in epistemic uncertainty. Right? So they create a code for potential and tolerance, which makes them more predictable to each other, which has its advantage for survival, right? But it also allows them, because they're no longer afraid from each other, to be more compassionate and more friendly, more cooperative. Okay? So that's in a metaphorical way what we're talking about. And then there is a way to create a precise measurement about when you will have culture going into being tolerant and allowing cooperation, and when its composition will emerge in such a way that will give actually preferences that are polarizing and that are leading to conflict and that are leading to the dissolvement of the contract curve. So they will no longer be able to cooperate, they'll no longer be able to gain benefit from this entity culture in the group which is characterized by. And by the way, I'm introducing also the idea of cultural clubs and how a person then decides whether to belong to a club, because a club may have benefit from existing and having its culture, but for certain individuals, it might be worthwhile for economic reasons to convert, right? So it's one thing what culture is. Culture is something that exists on aggregate level. You need to have two people in order to have culture, otherwise it's just a person. Something else, to do something. It's an agreed code. But then when culture exists, there is an interaction between the individual and the group, which is the interesting thing, where the cultural bias on economic choice emerges. And this is the topic of culture-based development. And then the book itself is structured along the 10 founding principles, as I call them, or 10 main things that I've managed to synthesize so far as a foundation of what I'm doing. It's kind of driving the analysis every time that I work on. The first 5 chapters introduce the main notions. So they go over what is culture, what in culture we have to measure, because culture is a complex and dynamic entity. Very well said. If you make a theoretical model, also gives you whatever you say, C, A, whatever you call it. But then if you want to go all the way and quantify, that's quite problematic. Complex dynamic, and by the way, it's the complex dynamic, but the complex way, it is an amalgam of all attitudes towards the world, because we said we make meaning towards anything and everything according to what from whatever helps us survive. And by the way, everything that I give as an explanation is not coming from my fantasy, creative thinking. I definitely have to agree with it with my imagination. But mostly I read different sources. So sources from psychology, sources from sociology. This thing for that I claim that we make meaning through culture, this is something which comes from psychology of emotion. And also, there are examples which are showing that it really is, and they come from treaties. They say, well, there are children that have been raised by wolves because they have been left in the forest. And then they start behaving like the wolf, because the wolf didn't eat them, bred them there as one of their cubs. And well, what does the child do? They don't develop language. This is also in the direction of, is language a measure of culture? So the book is also structured in this way. Every chapter goes over one notion, and then it defines the notion according to CBD. It gives a summary of the papers in which this notion has been studied by me, authors, okay? And at the end, has a summary of all the literature of other authors and disciplines that backs this, as well as noting some leading ideas that might be counter this, and why CBD would disagree, which may not make it very popular with too many people, but at least it's making the idea clear. So we said 5 main notions there, which are very cultural capital, cultural distance, cultural entropy, and ultimately cultural bias. So you need the first 4 in order to understand what is giving source to the cultural bias, how cultural bias emerges. And culture is the big thing, but we don't need every single attitude to every single thing, because the attitudes are traded off. And there are only some which are important for how we identify and based on what we act importantly in terms of whether we cooperate or not. If somebody eats an orange and you eat an apple, you won't go wage a war with the person, right? But there are certain aspects of our life which are more contagious and which are more related to our cultural identity. When we feel that this is contested, this is when we activate our cultural bias more. So how do we cut out the important variation of culture on which we act upon? Well, we have to see what is the cultural capital within culture. So cultural capital is the power of culture to bias the behavior. And then this cultural capital has to be also defined and identified its components in order for this complexity of it to be possible to be reduced using now very well-known complexity. Right? So in order to handle something complex, you have to know how many are the subsets to which it divides, up to 100% in order to be able to reduce meaningfully its variation. And then this subset would be the cultural heritage and living culture, which are the 2 pillars on which the whole operationalization hinges. And then the third notion is distance. Why cultural distance? Because this is the source of the variation. This is what makes a difference for us in order to discriminate, in order to prefer, in order to have a cultural variation based on culture. And then this be very simply sounding the difference between cultural heritage and the culture of people and places. But how you measure this starts getting very complicated question when it has to be precise, and that's what the 3rd chapter is about. The cultural distance tells you what is the magnitude of the cultural bias. It's not telling whether it will be positive or negative. It says, well, something is different. But if something is different, it will be like, oh, how interesting, or it will be like, kill. So the last will become the first. So you're late, but you haven't missed much. That's all we waited for a while before we started, and I'm making the overview of what the book is about. So I was going over the main notions, and we were now at the idea that cultural distance between people and places is the source of magnitude, the cultural bias effect. But we need something to predict precisely also the direction of this. So the direction comes from the complexity and the structure of cultural capital. Whether cultural heritage and culture are balanced. So whether the things that the way that we distinguish the big amalgam of attitudes in cultural heritage and culture, the reason is that some of the attitudes are inherited from the past, right? That makes sense how you split something very complex in 2 ways. Temporally wise, some things are generated in the past and some are generated now. Why this matters in this case? To split the big pie this way. You can split it many other ways. There are many people that split culture in many other ways. But this is the way that matters, because the things which come from the past, which is inherited from the past, A, is exogenous. So it doesn't depend on your current situation. Right? And this has all the implications for how you model and think of it. And then the things which are nowadays they depend on your situation, on your needs, you may want to convert this. But anyway, you inherit something which cannot change. So if you wish, there are also initial conditions effects in this. So there are many things that matter for the decision. Then you can have from another perspective, or humanistic perspective and psychological perspective, the things that you inherit are things that you do not have to create and don't have to change. The things that you acquire as identity, so acquired and inherited identity from psychologists, are things that you decide, where you have creativity, where you have choice in acting, you have agency, you have, I believe, you have free will to do that. So the balance between the two things will mean that you are equally likely to print something from the past as a behavior or to be adaptive to whatever the situation requires reason. Right? So then you are a reasonable person. You have a heuristic of the past, but you always check first, does it make sense or not? So when the two elements are balanced, you are rational. The moment that they are disbalanced, you start having some degree of cultural bias filtering it. You're always giving more weight to what you have learned before, or you are always doubting it too much instead of doing it even when it's in your advantage, right? And then you can hate and love either of them, depending on how your programming of the mind has happened to be culturally balanced. So that's how culture ends up being a wiring of the mind. Whether this mind is open to adjustment of the cultural variation of things, or is it stuck in a particular ordering, which does not update every time for the situation, doesn't require thinking. Okay. And this is your heuristical mode of operation that culture has taught you to behave this way, and those around you behave. Which, of course, doesn't mean that there might not, in a group of people for certain culture, some may for free will reasons or whatever, random idiosyncratic occurrence might not be that biased as everybody else, right? But on average, that's what's likely to be the case. So you want to know how culture, heritage, and living culture of a place of functioning of the person, of holding of his mind, where he was raised. How it is. Is it balanced so he's rich, or is it disbalanced so they have some degree of bias? The more disbalanced culture, heritage, and living culture are, the higher the obviously the bias. But when the bias goes completely for the one club, this means that the other club, whichever it is, right, will be completely disadvantaged, because in equal terms, always preferential treatment will be given to the other group, whichever the group is. Right? So then, this is the moment where the world collapses. This is the moment where you have the contract curve disappearing. Potentially, people could agree. If they're rational, they could agree. But de facto, they refuse. Okay? And then there is a kind of theoretization how this happens, and then empirical work showing that this is actually the case. So the first 5 chapters go over the main notions. They end up with cultural bias, explaining that cultural bias is essentially the terms of the permissible set, from which on it is predictable what people will choose. And it gives the market for values, how each and every attitude is uptaken by a person according to his endogenous situation at the moment in terms of survival. If he has benefit from a culture, he uptakes and becomes part of it. If not, he is exiting the market. Like a very simple setting of a perfectly competitive market for firms, but applied on the case of how attitudes emerge, and then how we aggregate this to a code of preferences. This is what is described in the first 5 chapters. The next 4 chapters give us applications of this theoretization and quantification of cultural bias. They take different models and augment them with the cultural heritage and living culture, and explain them in different ways how they become better predictive and manage to factor in the emergence of culture in the process. They're divided into direct and indirect effect, because sometimes culture is part of the characteristics we consider during the choice, but sometimes, just like in spatial frictions, you make a choice, but the pool of the things that you're choosing from has been reduced or increased due to the cultural bias of the place where you are. Okay? So think of the case, if I'm choosing where to migrate, I'm thinking, okay, what's the culture in the place? What are the amenities there? So this is a direct case of cultural bias, mean toward place. And perhaps also factoring whether people feel biased. But if I'm fairly non-biased person and I just want to hire somebody who is a good IT expert, but if my government has found people from India and people from countries which have a lot of experts, or the top experts in the field, right? And if I'm not able to find this person, there is another company with the same resources like me, with the same mindset like me as management, but they're in a country which is open for this kind of IT experts. Well, there will be a cultural bias into who will succeed how due to the indirect effect of culture. These two cases were when cultural entropy varies between cultural heritage and living culture to some extent. There are also the further two chapters of direct and indirect effect, when cultural entropy is completely zero. So one of the clubs takes over the other. There is no balance. These are the cases when the contract disappears first and then the whole world collapses. And they're illustrated with political vote. When a person decides to go to a polarized club, and then how this affects the logos of economic. The last chapter, the very free analysis of values, explains how the paradigm, thus defined and illustrated in the previous chapters, is doing what Lawrence Yannacone does in Religion and Economics, approached by him. I'm trying to understand what is the effect of any culture, given that it is structured and evolves in a particular structural way. I'm not saying this culture is good or this culture is bad, although I'm inspired indeed by Max Weber, who was saying, okay, different cultures, different forms of capitalism, because different religions teach you different attitudes. But my take on the analysis is that you don't need to qualify the cultures themselves, and that any culture is possible in certain moments in time dynamically to reach the position where there will be a discrimination, there will be a collapse of the system. In other words, where hate will prevail over love given certain circumstances, if we use a more everyday language. Now, if you were a student, or if you just have time and you want to have fun, I have written the Robinson Crusoe story for explaining the main notions of culture-based development as main principles. It's mnemonic. It's also something which is usually done. Robinson Crusoe story is used. You can find this at the website of culture-based development in the section for the book. One can download it. It was intended to be the first book, the first chapter in the book, like a prologue. But then for brevity, I kept only the theoretical things in. So these are the chapters. And in a way, the first 5 are covering what does it mean to be culture-based. And the other 4 are saying, well, how this cultural base affects development on micro and on aggregate level. And then the overall philosophy of value-free analysis of values. which is also with Nietzschean kind of touch to it. So this more or less covers the topic of the book and its content. Different kind of people read it, appreciated it. Aldrich is a person from entrepreneurship. The person who worked with me and made the proofreading of the book and so forth is a microeconomist from Bologna University. So people from different backgrounds managed to find something in it. And I am very grateful for this. But the method that is used behind, from economics point of view, is very standard, but this makes it possible to be a founding principle. Okay? That you think of culture in the basic founding ways that economics thinks about problems. Okay? So it's not necessarily making things fancy, it's making sense of things the way that economists make sense of things. Okay? Because this has not been done. You can find any kind of approximations, the economists trying to be anthropologists, trying to be ethnographers, trying to be evolutionary biologists and whatever, but they don't try to be economists when they're talking about culture that much. Okay, they over rely in many ways in the definitions and the approaches to this. And I'm thinking, doing some quite basic things like the perfectly competitive market, or taking some basic standard approaches in complexity theory, like complexity theory reduces complexity by using Shannon entropy. This is one of the core things, standard things. Well, we can use this core method for reducing the complexity of culture. And we can make this into cultural entropy. So the Shannon entropy index applied on culture. If we define that culture is 100% inherited and acquired attitudes, then you have to know what is the balance between them, what percentage of the attitudes that are celebrated locally are inherited, and how many of the things that people practice are modern and fashionable. And then you can understand the Shannon entropy in terms of an index, Shannon entropy index, between these two subcomponents of culture, which will vary between 0 and 1, because that's what Shannon entropy is when you have two classes. And then when things are balanced, the Shannon entropy is 1. And when things are completely disbalanced, one of the classes completely dominates, the Shannon entropy is 0. And now you see how this kind of tools, which exist in economics and other sciences, quantitative sciences, allow us to turn what I told you as a story into something which is much closer to what economists do than ethnography, anthropology, economic history, and so on. You can do the things as a microeconomist for culture. And this is the new thing. There are many interesting approaches to culture on aggregate level, or there are microeconomic approaches for culture, but on a very small segment of culture. And this is thinking about culture as a big thing, as an economist, as a microeconomist. So this said, then you can apply to different standard models again and augment them. So if you have the market entry model, and you think of it as a depiction of whether a migrant is accepted by the majority locally with boisterous disagreement, or with, well, who cares, one more, right? Normally they should have this. This would be the big entity there locally, attitude, right? But it's possible that in some cases a locality behaves in this way, and in some cases it is having not very optimal behavior. It starts kind of opposing this entry of the market, which is not efficient from economic point of view. It is biased, it's culturally biased. Then by how much it will be culturally biased depends on the cultural entropy. The more disbalanced culture, heritage and living culture are, the more people are sticking locally to the inherited rather than the acquired identity. With the same percentage, there will be a probability likelihood that people will be playing actually irrational in the game. And that's how you know what their strategies will be and what their beliefs will be and how they'll play. Right? Otherwise, the game itself, everybody knows it. It has its setting and everybody can solve it. The problem is you don't know who will be what and how they will play, right? Well, with this, you can predict, and you can predict why there will be certain types and play certain strategies. And so if you want, the book can be read then in a different way. It's the story of cultural entropy, which is giving the effect, a direction of the effect, whether it will be, positive or negative towards a particular outcome, depending on how it is disbalanced. And then the cultural distance will tell you the magnitude of this effect. And also the story is about cases when cultural entropy is between 0 and 1, when there is some cultural bias, or cultural entropy approaching 0, when you have the Polanyian collapse of the world. Okay? And of course, it is not about rational choice, because rational choice is the case where cultural entropy is 1. So things are balanced, people update themselves every time they have to. That's also an evolutionary strategy for the reason that we started with, but in a different way. It doesn't borrow from biological sources and doesn't try to talk about sexual dominances and as normally it is done when they borrow from. It is thinking of culture itself as a survival strategy that has its effect on choice by decreasing the uncertainty, also by on aggregate level by solving the Arrow's impossibility theorem. Because once you have culture, it's essentially the benevolent dictator. So because you're in the group, ultimately you have to be with the group. And then it's possible always to go over conflict. But this is only as long as you have belonging to culture that obliges you this, right? Otherwise, you can, if it is really, really uncomfortable, then you go and make another cultural club, or you become excommunicated over there. But you don't belong to this cultural club anymore. Now, this is also, as I told you, neo-Weberian, in the sense mostly that what Weber was saying is their attitudes, they're culturally predictable, and these attitudes predict different economic outcomes given the same economic inputs. This was his main take when he was talking about economics and religion. Then actually he was lopsided and oversimplified. That, he said that Protestants are better than Catholics. He never said that. If you go over his books, the guy is talking about attitudes. And I went over his books. I like some things. Some things he was wrong. He was saying that Bulgarians and the Slavic languages do not have coincidence of the word, biruf and rufen from religion. So they don't have a linguistic link between occupation and religion, which is absolutely wrong, because prizvanje comes from zuva, which is calling, which is rufen, which is just didn't know. But nevertheless, I take an issue with how he measures culture and how precise he's in measuring culture, but I definitely am okay with his main culture-based hypothesis, essentially. And so what I build on in this case is, instead of measuring culture multidimensionally, just with religion or with other one-dimensional aspects, and it was Desmet who recently said, what do we measure when we measure culture with just a one-dimensional aspect? And I wanted to kiss him. It was like, bravo, somebody else to say what I was thinking. So I also said it. He has also written it both in papers, so now I always cite that. And I started trying to go in the footsteps of Weber by making studies on the same geographies, how culture affects local development, local productivity, but quantifying culture not as religion, but as culture, heritage, living culture, and the balance between them. And I did it not only myself, but I also invited colleagues to do it. So there is a first special issue, which was about this in the International Journal of Manpower. It is about the Occident, as he is calling. So this is dedicated to his Protestant spirit of capitalism. Then with Yue, the PhD student that I had, we made, she was from China, so we celebrated also, it coincided 150 years of the birth of Max Weber, and there was this special issue in Journal of Economic Issues on culture-based development in the regions of China. So there were different colleagues from China mostly contributing towards it. And now there are two special issues. If you're interested, you can contribute to them. The one is culture-based development in the regions of India, which was his third book, and it is placed in Region, which is the journal of European Regional Science Association. And the other is in the emblematic journal of the International Society of Quality of Life Studies, and it is dedicated to his last book, which is comparison between the Semitic religions. Right? He wrote especially for ancient Judaism, but the special issue is comparison between the well-being drivers for Jews, Christians, and Muslims within a place and also across places, how these people fare. So that said, there is also a policy application of culture-based development, which is related essentially to aesthetic education. Because how do you begin these things from the past, your attitudes from the past, and your attitudes today? Well, somebody teaches you, but mostly this is aesthetic education. No matter whether it is your parents, as Bourdieu was saying, who have certain objects at home and they'll expose you, or they'll bring you to the theater or whatever, they bring you all the variation of the system by engaging you in the things which are culture. So it's an aesthetic education, what's good, what's bad. Nothing is per se good or per se bad, per se beautiful or per se ugly. It is the aesthetic education that wires our brain for our appreciation. And that's a thing that can be invested in by public authorities. It's related to public investment in the arts, in things like libraries, things like community centers as well, social capital of places. And there is a brief that is written on culture-based development and aesthetic education, which is supported by the International Pascal Observatory, with which I'm working. It's kind of a UNESCO OECD organization for bringing forward the idea of knowledge for all and learning cities, as they put. So final slide. What is the value added there? Well, culture-based development is not manna from heaven and solving every problem in the world. It's doing two things. It is solving the turtle problem and elephant problem of how culture is handled in economic status. The turtle problem is the fact that we have the knowledge of preferences, but nobody knows where the preferences come from. So everything goes as a story, as a model, but ultimately in the causal chain, the first thing is the preference. So whatever kind of model you, right? And then the fact that you have it undefined is like a turtle which is standing there, potentially on infant row turtles. There is nothing big below. Well, instead of this, the thing which is put under the turtle is the economic fundamental of market for values. How a person learns these attitudes on the market for values and takes them, partially inheriting it, but also partially updating them nowadays in order for this survival code also to be meaningful, right? The fact that culture updates is also saying to what degree culture will be able to be efficient in increasing the survival potential of people and how long culture itself will survive. A culture which is more rigid, right? It may be currently creating kind of a stronger club, but then it will be less useful for, and Lawrence Yanacon has shown these 4 religious clubs, indeed. And then, but I expanded for cultural clusters. Then the elephant problem is the operational part of how culture is measured. Because of course you can find thousands of processes of culture, but then there are 2 problems. First, you cannot compare the studies across, so you can learn very little cumulatively, and normally that's how knowledge a thing is made in science, right? So while it is a fashion with how much more unique and fancy measure for culture will come up, this actually tragic because then you cannot learn from anybody except for the particular person that is developing, right? And there is even a worse problem that if culture matters, as more or less everybody agrees now in economics. There was a period when nobody cared about culture. Now they give them Nobel laureates if they deal with culture anyhow. But if culture matters, if something matters in the model, and you under quantify, what is the main consequence? You have under specification of the model due to under quantification something that matters. So it's a big deal of under quantifying something that matters. Right? And for some reason, economists know this, they live by this, right? But when it comes to culture, they just forget, they don't apply. And well, culture-based development tries to serve this possibility to always measure the local cultural setting in a way that it predicts the propensity of the attitudes and the cultural bias, no matter on what this cultural bias will. Well, and now that's what I believe and what I sort of know. But because we know that truth is born in discussion, we'll have a discussion of our wonderful panel here that patiently listened to me. And Nigel and then Danny will tell us how they see culture-based development from the economic and from the sociological perspective, and I will shut up. So the floor is yours.
Are there slides for me to go through, or just do you want me to just
There are, but if you, as you prefer,
not really well?
I can put them.
Well, let's see what slides are on then, because I mean I would apologise turning up late. Just something I just could not get out of, and it just went on and on and on. So I'm mindful that you've probably been here maybe longer than you expected, and I certainly hope that you weren't waiting for me. So. Given that I'm speaking to a group of economists and Howard here, but I suppose you've got an awful lot more to say about this probably than the rest of us. And I guess what I'd like to do, when you start with a quote and it's almost throw something out at you, and I'm sure that Howard would know the answer to this, but I mean, I've given, and that sort of sets you up for fairly, doesn't it? But I mean, the quote there is, if anyone's heard of it before, it's quite a famous quote, but it's trying to pin down where it comes from. And this is the part, that's why I'm throwing it out there. So I'm not 100% convinced I know where it comes from. I think I know where it comes from, but it's the idea about standing on the shoulder of giants. Does anyone know where that comes from? I think that original phrase is, well, it's from Isaac Newton. I think it's some of his works, obviously a grandee of science there, but I guess where I recognise it more candidly from would be from that's the fourth studio album of Oasis. That was what they was called. So maybe I'm showing my culture in that sense and where I'm coming from. But I guess I'm mindful that I don't want to take too much time, but I want to sort of give an overview of the context of what we have here. It was going back to that idea about standing upon the shoulders of the giants, because Annie's mentioned this, and what we have in economics is that I guess there's that natural conflict more recently in the past sort of 40 years, so in between what we might describe ourselves as classical or neoclassical economics and more sort of heterodox models. And I guess with the heterodox, it looks more to do with, it's not interested necessarily in the econometrics, it's more around the sort of institutions. And within these models that we know, going back to 1776, we've got the wealth of nations and that whole history that builds up from there. And we've got classical economists, we've got Nobel laureates, we've got game theorists. And I guess for me, that's what this book builds upon. It's not necessarily the heterodox economics. And you might think that culture fits within that part, but it's not that exogenous treatment of a variable as a control, but it's built upon what determines culture. And for me, that's where the value of this book and that paradigm and that framework lies. So if we go through various chapters, you will see that, and Annie's already alluded to it, there is mention to standard traditional micro theory, but this is then applied to it. There's an awful lot of game theory in there, that we've got game trees, we've got decisions, we identify what would be sort of sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium, building upon all of those fundamentals of economic theory, as I said, going all the way back to Adam Smith and then moving forward. An expression I used before, that we're taking these and it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but we've got that traditional theory, but we've got this new element, and it's not disavowing itself. It's not moving away from that traditional theory, that neoclassical view, and that econometric and that robust empirical analysis that we know has driven much of the economic literature on for the past, 300 plus years. So I'll leave it there, given that I'm almost preaching to the converted, and I'll leave Daniel to give us some wonderful insights into.
I want first to make a comment on what you just said. So
to argue, is that what it is?
no, to further clarify it, it was very good points. The one of it was about the heterodox economics. So there are pockets in economics, and the other is about institutions. There are pockets in economics that have delved on culture in one or another way, but they do it in a manner which is inconsistent with the standard economic development. They even make it into a point, they make it into a part of their culture as a group, not to use mathematics, so they know a lot of the complexities of culture, but they study them and they present them in a way which is just incompatible with the rest of the people. So my endeavor here is just the opposite, actually to translate all their knowledge into a way which will be more just possible to plug to the standard system of how people approach the things, especially from empirical point of view, it's already done, okay? And then the theoretical part of it, I'm very lucky that there is a guy from China who started theorizing all this formally, which is where I want to go and to continue going with that. The other part, the throwing the baby out with the water, this is the example of the institutionalists, okay? So many people try to speak of something related to culture and to start building from there. And even if you wish, there is a long debate and contestation between John Hall and Douglas North. They were having a correspondence where John Hall, who was the first speaker at my first launch, and Nigel knows him, is a professor from Portland State University. He's one of the major figures in old institutional economics, and he was saying to Douglas North, all this that you took from uncertainty, it's actually from Veblen. Yeah, but he was saying, well, yes, I really read it from Veblen. I don't deny that, but I do something further with this information. I pass it through a different methodology and I make it compatible. But while, John was quite upset with Douglas North, he sort of rethought it perhaps, and he's one of the main champions of culture-based development, and that's why he got also the first prize, the award of culture-based development for 2025, which is a tradition which will carry on further, and you can read about it on the website of the Paradigm. So there are such things as social capital and as institutions, and there are a lot of good contributions in economics around it. But if you apply the chain rule, they also are derived from culture. So they again are just part of the infinite turtle. So thank you for these comments, because this depicts exactly where the infinite turtle that I'm talking about is coming. So with that, Danny, last but not least ever.
So rather than commenting on the book, as somebody who comes to it from a rather very different disciplinary perspective that also conceptualizes culture in quite distinct ways, what I would like to do is to raise a few questions for the air for discussion, to bring the original contributions of your book into focus. So something that I particularly appreciated reading it and coming to it from a different disciplinary perspective is its theoretical depth and your readiness to work across disciplinary boundaries and draw on quite a range of, economic and sociological and anthropological and philosophical perspectives on culture. So the first question that I have for you in that regard is, you define culture as a kind of collectively devised market for values, right? And as a way of managing individually put survival in the context of uncertainty, and that definition of culture that you have developed in the beer book draws on, again, quite a range of cross-disciplinary theoretical resources. So in a nutshell, then, on the basis of your cross-disciplinary approach to culture, where in economics and where in the social sciences more broadly would you locate your original contribution to the understanding of culture?
Okay, so you give me the questions one by one.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I don't know exactly if I'll claim depth or breadth. The question is that it was a genuine quest of understanding what is culture, because the contribution is meant to be a contribution to mainstream economics, to help mainstream economics actually learn as economics and not just copy paste from somewhere else something that does not fit very well to it. So it was really inspired by my PhD supervisor, because he asked me, Annie, okay, culture, you're here for culture, I chose you for this. But how do you want to approach? Make your literature review, tell me how it is measured, how it's defined, how it's measured. And I went there, labored like a slave, and I went back and I showed him, 70 pages, literally 70 pages, literature review of only economic literature, top journals. And it is every time defined differently, every time measured differently. He was like, what is this? That's impossible. Then he was a labor economist. He showed me properly, like, yeah, but the literature is like, and then he told me, go wherever you want to go, but come back with a definition that makes sense. And then I was just sincerely and genuinely trying to find everything that I could reach that defines culture. And I was also thinking about it, and then I was fascinated that everything I could think about, somebody wrote about. The problem is they wrote patchy about. And then it might have breadth of coverage, but definitely it's not covering everything. Including, I had recently a presentation at the that only heterodox, the European Association for Political Economics, right? The last thing in the last conference in Athens. And I made my presentation. It was very well received. There was this wonderful guy there who said, and do you know Joseph Henry? I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But I had not noticed, as you're saying right now, that the weird idea comes from him. And so I haven't included everybody. I've included the things that were really most consistent with each other and most unavoidable, so that we have the complete picture. But I'm sure that there are also wonderful things like people who are not part of it, or we were talking about, so there are people who are using and trying to make contributions in this field also by using just game theory and organizational behavior. So there are many interesting things which are happening out there. I'm actually focusing on something very particular, culture, which is very broad, very complex, coming from all the things. I'm trying just to translate all of this in the language of neoclassical economics, in order to make neoclassical economics slightly better in making inquiry in the cultural bias choice. But I think that's quite an important contribution, because every choice is, in the end of the day, a culturally biased choice. Unless you suppress the cultural bias intentionally by having emotional intelligence, how to balance it when you're afraid in order to become rational. Okay? So we have to teach this skill in order to make rational choices from practice. That's the whole story of it.
All right. So, mindful of time here, but let me ask you one more question at least. That's quite central, I think, to your work as well. So your commandments of culture-based development, the 10 core propositions of your work, articulate how culture originates from this tension between freedom and uncertainty, and the way in which that needs to be managed, so to speak. Of these 10 core propositions of your work, which one do you see as most critical, or perhaps most difficult to demonstrate empirically?
Oh, well, thanks. First of all, save God their commandments. they exist, these 10 principles of culture-based development, in order to save economics from being religiously practiced. And finally becoming very free in the way that it studies culture, and instead of allowing the cultural, religious, or whatever kind of biases of economists to interfere with what they're doing, which is something that has been happening in the past and continues scrolling in different forms and shapes. Nowadays, quantitative economists and quantitative workers and economists are super unaware of the researcher bias, unlike sociologists and everybody who's familiar with quantitative work. So culture-based development is equipping them with a way to cure their own bias. You look at culture as part of the model in an objective way. Right? And that's why they're principles, they're not commandments. And you have read the book, I mentioned it jokingly at the end, but it's exactly not to be commandments, right? That's thanks for reading and for booking. Which of them? Well, they are there exactly because they cannot go without each other. That's why it is a complex thing that has to be sorted out. So you have the entity culture, right? And you have to define it in a way that people finally sort it out as economists, because they, have the fuzzy idea about culture, and they think that's okay to be the case, which, I mean, if you want to identify something you cannot afford, and this is their own commandment that they're swearing by, so they should somehow get out of the Schrodinger's cat state of existence and live by their own words. Then after I define it, I have to operationalize it, and all the other principles. The first one is how you think of culture, define culture. Clear, not fuzzy. And then how you operationalize it requires that you understand further notions. So each of the principles is about how you think of a particular notion, and you need all the notions in order to be able to quantify. So the first 5 notions are the ones necessary to be able to identify and operationalize the components of culture that give rise to the cultural bias. They are the cultural distance and the cultural entropy. So if you wish, cultural entropy, but combined with cultural distance, are the main components. But then you cannot know what they are if you don't know what's cultural heritage living culture, and what's cultural capital, and how it relates to culture. Then the other ones, they are calling them principles because I keep talking about it, because the first model that I went with these cultural heritage and living culture components and cultural entropy is the so-called gravity model. So gravity models were supposedly for trade, then were used also for other aspects of including migration and so on. And my point is that essentially culture always creates a gravitational effect towards one type of choice rather than another. So it's more like generalizing the taste for discrimination of this manner. Then the other chapters are depicting you the behavior of cultural entropy. They're telling you how, for different levels, you have different outcomes of the aggregate model. So you have either a bias model that loses efficiency, which corresponds to the degree of the cultural bias, or the whole world collapses, which is something maybe very heterodox, because normally they think that there must be a contract curve that's just shifting. But the thing is, you can show any reality. We can see the war, pick one of the wars, which but that's definitely the one which is in the Middle East. I mean, they haven't stopped. So there are cases when the contract curve just does not catch up with reality, although theoretically it might be there. And we have to acknowledge this and understand where it comes from in order to solve it. Otherwise, we'll never solve it, right? We could just say, oh, no, this is not the case. It is a case, and it's a case of the model, and we have to go. So they're all together. All the 10 things are necessary in order for want to be able to use culture and to know how to expect it to affect the model. Yes.
Thank you. And I think even though I've got more questions to ask, that's probably where I should finish.
All right, then. Thank you very much. We have been only 5 minutes longer than promised because we started 15 minutes later. I want to do two things. First of all, to thank the two speakers with a cup of tea, because you're my cup of tea. Thank you very
Well,
much.
Thank you very much.
We started with a cup of tea.
Thank you.
And the second is, of course, to open the floor for questions from you if you have anything to say with us.
Can you choose the third option? My wife is waiting for the, can I find you in the apartment in the next days? Can I ask you the question?
Of course.
Great.
Well, thank you for coming.
Yes, sure. Sounds good. See you later.
Actually, I was the other thing that I wanted to ask you. Oh, can you stay one more second so that we all take a picture together and then nearby the 14.
Yes.
Now, down front and centre, just. Very well, thank you. Good to see you now, likewise.
There. You know?
It's roasting and nice photograph.
Yeah, I'm rolling down. Well, look over. You should be in the picture as well, Annie. Do you want to take a picture? I didn't take the eyes. Very good. So, oh, yeah. So, there you go, we do. And now we. But open and put Nigel, would you like to go on the template? So that everybody's. See you guys. Thank you so much for being. Take pictures of you.
Oh, sorry.
In the back.
The house live treating then, Howard. Do you miss the place? Well, no, I mean, I told you.
You go from part of the.
So I've got the facility.
You got also.
I have got you step after you reach my reach. I'm not sure you also go on with it. It's right. I'm not what I saw. I'm going to think it's going to go. Right. I hope you're so. It's fine. You go in this. Absolutely not. I think absolutely.
No, I
think
think
I think that. But
yeah.
they must spend any time with the past. Yeah.
So sweet on it.
And controls.
Knocking them behind.
Yeah. What of interest is going on in the auditorium then?
Well, if I'm set up, we're all now. Fine with them. I'm just trying to get the right all advice for you, is it? It's happens.
No, but it's not so much. No, the savings that people always extend out of the store. No, Look, I'd like to. The cost. Work is in the last. Arms. Sorry, yeah, but this all. Oh, it's not